government for? What do we need the government for? What do we need it for? Yes?
To do the tasks that no one else wants to do.
To do the tasks that no one else wants to do. For example, what?
Build roads.
Build roads? Nobody
Do
wants to build
sanitation.
roads. Do sanitation? Nobody wants to do sanitation. Okay, anything else? Yes? They make decisions for a larger population. Okay, so let me just clarify. I said government, I really meant the states, right? So earlier in the semester, we had a distinction between governments and states. Corporation is a kind of government. But I mean states. Why do we need a state? Yes?
Regulate industry.
Regulate industry. So we got do the things other people don't want to do, regulate industry. Sorry, your suggestion was make decisions for larger groups. What else? Yes? You had your hand up? No? Yes? Organize people. Organize people. We need government to organize people. People don't get organized without government. Is this an organization of people? Did you need the government to tell you to show up today? Okay. Yeah?
Could you represent and make decisions for the country on the national stage?
They represent the interests of the country on an international scale? Sure. Yeah.
To enforce laws or to pay others to enforce laws.
Enforce laws. Took you guys a while to get to laws. This is economics law policy class. That's good. In the back?
They provide services that smaller groups can't or other groups.
Yeah, so that was earlier points, things people can't do on their own. In the back, I thought I saw a hand. No? So all those are very common reasons why we need governments. Let's just focus on one. The law. Who's heard of the Wild West? What was the Wild West? Yes? Lawless land. Where? West, where? The Western United States. The lawless lands of the Western United States. What was so lawless about them? Yeah. There was no governments. Why? Who knows the history, really? Yeah.
They argue that there were governments.
Sorry, quiet down, please.
I'm going to argue that there were governments, just not ones that were recognized by the Europeans.
Okay, make your case.
Native Americans existed. Native Americans had societies. Native Americans had laws and governments.
Yeah.
They were there.
So that's true. So why do they call it the Wild West? And it's definitely because there was a sense of lawlessness. What do they mean?
The laws that the Americans, or whatever European group you want to use for that, weren't being enforced in the way that they wanted to. There wasn't power in the way they wanted to be there at that point.
Very good points. In those Western cities, and there were, so I'll just give you a bit of a brief history. So the Europeans came. Columbus famously landed in the Caribbean. The Spaniards and Portuguese took over South America, and then the English and French came through North America. When the English and French came, there were lots of wars, treaties, and other sorts of, let's call them negotiation tactics between the Europeans and the natives on this land. And they had some land of their own. The Europeans got a little bit blood-hungry, bloodthirsty, a little bit more power-thirsty. Who sort of manifest destiny? Good number of you. What was manifest destiny?
It was the European belief that because they settled the land, they deserved to take all of the land from the natives.
Almost. It was the American belief, the United States people. They thought that the entire continent of North America should be part of the United States. And they did this through many ways. The War of 1812 was part of Manifest Destiny. The Americans thought they could just waltz into Canada. They'll be greeted as liberators. And you know how that story went, right? The Canadians went and burned down the White House. Famous story of the War of 1812 that also lasted for 2 years. But another thing that the Americans did was that they tried to get more Europeans to settle Western lands. West being basically west of the Mississippi. And they were promising vast swaths of land to anyone who went out there. Something called homesteading we talked about. But homesteading basically said you go out there and you plant a flag and it's basically yours. And there were other instances where they had people line up and it was a race. The government had come in and they declared some piece of land as their own. They'd drawn up lines and they put flags there and they lined up people. They lined up everybody and they said, go, whoever touches the flag, that's their property. They did stuff like that. They also did other stuff where they just said to somebody, hey, there's some plot of land out there in what's now Indiana. If you go out there, it's yours. And they gave such a plot of land to a group of Christian missionaries who went out there and they went to build a church there and a school. And they get there and a local Native American tribe shows up and says, what are you doing here? And they said, well, the government of the United States told that this is our land, that they got this land from you guys in a treaty. And the natives said, no, you didn't. This is our land. Get off it or there will be some trouble. What the missionaries did, they said, okay, we'll cut you a deal. We stay on this land, we'll build a school, and for the rest of eternity, all of your children and their ancestors, etc., can come to this school for free. That school developed into the University of Notre Dame, and to this day they still have that agreement, where that if you're a student, a native from that area, you can get admitted with no tuition. That's one of the better stories. There were, of course, instances where further out west, in California, for example, in the southwestern United States, what's now New Mexico, the Europeans came and they had to make their own law. There was no federal law. There was no other European law. They had to settle things with the natives themselves. Sometimes it got bloody, but most of the time, people don't want to go to war. War is dangerous, war is bloody, war is traumatic, and it's costly. It's expensive to go to war. The Wild West was not so what. It was not so what. The article, the reading for this class is called The Not So Wild Wild West by Terry Anderson and co-author, whose name is escaping me. They document all of the small laws that the communities made by themselves. A bunch of Europeans came into a little area, there was gold there was opportunities for ranching, and as cattlemen, they came around and they said, okay, how can we come to agreements so that we don't kill each other? These guys were not educated. They were not. Most of them weren't literate, but they still were able to come to collective agreements so that they're not killing each other. They basically spontaneously came up with the common law. The United States federal government didn't like this, that they were creating their own little tiny cities that were free from the control of the United States federal government. So then the United States government made up this myth of the Wild West as being some lawless land where there was tons of killing and then stories were written about it. But it wasn't true. There were many towns in the western United States where there was 0 killings a year. 0. The Wild West was more peaceful than the current West of the United States. The article goes into some detail as well about how Native Americans had their own property rights. And it also gets into this myth that the Native Americans did not have any property rights. They did. They had to have property rights. But it also breaks down the myth that Native Americans had a monolithic property right regime for the entire Native America. No. Native Americans had different tribes in different areas with different conditions on the ground. In the western and southwestern United States, they had a different set. They had different sets of rules than they did in the Northeast, because the conditions were different. Hunting rules were different. The land was different. The number of people was different. So they came up with different ideas. The punchline is that there can't be a group of people without law. Unless, of course, you mean legislation, which we said at the beginning of the semester, people confuse the word law and legislation. They jumble them together, say, oh, because there's no legislation, they assume there must be no law. But people come up with law themselves. They have to. Let's also talk about, oh, yes.
Then what does that make Somalia? Because they're like entirely government collapse and they're a lawless state.
Thank you for asking about Somalia. Who can tell me about what's happening in Somalia right now? Who knows anything about Somalia? Yes.
Pirates, right?
They have pirates in Somalia, sure. Who knows what else about Somalia?
Corruption.
Corruption? We don't have corruption here?
Yes, we do.
So how's that make Somalia different?
They do have corruption.
Yeah.
Yes, they have corruption.
So what makes Somalia different? Who can tell me a brief history of Somalia? About why everyone talks about Somalia? What's the big deal about Somalia? Yes?
Not the big deal, but like most of their money comes from like ransoms and stuff like that. Like that's basically like all I know about them. Is that they had like really big hostage cases where like they won millions and millions of dollars and like that's a job there.
Yeah. So it's true that they have a piracy problem on the seas. So that's a big problem. I wouldn't say that's where they get most of their money. So I'll give you a brief history. In the early 90s, Somalia, the government of Somalia fell to some sort of coup attempt. And for the last 30 years, basically, there's been a war in Somalia over trying to establish a new national government. The UN has been there for several decades now. I think since at least the early 2000s. And they've established what they call a government there, but it has no power. So effectively, Somalia is a land without legislation. People then call it an anarchic society. Anarchic. Comes from the word anarchy. When you hear the word anarchy, what does that mean to you? What does anarchy mean? Yes?
No government.
No government. So that's one definition. Anything else it could mean? If I open a dictionary, look up the word anarchy, is the first definition no government? What else would it say? Yeah.
Isn't it more like disorder and chaos?
Disorder and chaos. That's what most people think of when they think of anarchy, is disorder and chaos. Just breaking down this word. An plus archy. An means without. What does archy mean? Like a monarchy. Yeah.
A leadership.
Ruler. A ruler. Anarchy means without issue of Somalia, where they don't have a central government. People then claim it's an anarchy, but when they mean by anarchy, most people think of anarchists and anarchy as being chaotic, destructive, violent people. And there's definitely some of that going on in Somalia, but not all of Somalia. It's true that there's a big, we call it a power vacuum. You've all heard this term. The main government fell, and now people are fighting and killing each other to become the new rulers. Over 30 years, there hasn't been a winner yet. But instead, we have different tribes, nomadic tribes, other tribes. They're calling for them, they have their own systems of rules for themselves. Most of them are Islamic. Some of them are non-Islamic. But they have their own sets of rules. And here's the interesting thing. You can belong to a tribe, and then you follow the rules of that tribe. If you get into a conflict with someone from another tribe, the two tribes have rules among themselves for how to deal with intertribal conflict. The piracy issue in Somalia, do you think that affects mostly other Somalians? Are they kidnapping and stealing from other Somalians as pirates, or are they kidnapping people who they don't have intertribal relations with? The question answers itself. Some other fun facts I'll post under this video. Even though Somalia has been in basically a perpetual state of war for about 30 years, even though they don't have a central government, even though there have been lots of other competing powers and they've got these piracy problems that make international trade difficult, there have still been some improvements to the quality of life there. For example, Somalia has the most cell phone towers per capita in all of Africa. They didn't have any cell phone towers in the 90s when this problem started breaking out. There have been other quality of life improvements, but just this one is quite stark. Lots of people in Somalia have cell phones and other mobile devices where they make payments electronically. They do this even though there is no central organizing government giving one law to everybody, building up these things. Businesses spontaneously evolved to deal with these issues, and the tribes are dealing with the legal ramifications without a central government. Let's also talk about pirates. Is a pirate ship a lawless place? No. Why not? Yeah.
Amongst the pirates, they have rules and laws, which what they can and can't do with each other.
Yeah. There's a great book. Who's heard of the phrase invisible hand? The invisible hand. Okay, so that's about half of you, but the invisible hand comes from it's an old expression, but it's mostly associated with a guy named Adam Smith, who most people say is the founder of modern economics. And he says, if you leave the market to itself, it guides, production processes come about as if led by an invisible hand. An economist named Peter Leeson wrote a book called The Invisible Hook. It was about pirates. It's about how pirate ships organized laws amongst themselves. Who had the most power on a pirate ship? Who had the most power on a pirate ship? Who do you think? Yeah.
Captain.
Wrong. Any other guesses? Yeah.
Cook.
No. Yes? No. The person who who
drives the ship.
drives. So that's basically mostly the captain, right? Who's heard of the quartermaster? The quartermaster, what's the quartermaster do?
I think they like kind of organize everyone. I'm not really sure. It's like a manager kind of process.
Your quarters are where you sleep at night. The quartermaster was whoever was in charge of the bunks and the sleeping situation among the crew. But he had more responsibilities than that as well. And power on the ship was basically split 50-50 between the captain and the quartermaster. But there were some instances where the quartermaster overruled the captain. Pirates came up with their own constitution, where they detailed the powers that the quartermaster has, the powers that the captain has, how to divvy up the booty that they collected. Yeah.
Is there a difference between like other pirate ships, or does each pirate ship have their own sort of constitution? Or is it like general towards?
Good question. Each pirate ship had its own little rules, but there were a lot of similarities across different pirate ships. It's just another way of organizing. Any questions on pirates? Who wants to draw some supply and demand graphs? No? Okay, so I guess most of you didn't hear about this, but today was supposed to be a big national walkout among students in solidarity with the Native the Native Canadians and their property rights issues with the Canadian federal government. I received an email asking me to cancel my class today in solidarity so that the students can then leave. I thought about it, and I thought I record my lectures anyway, so I might as well just have my lesson as usual, and anybody who wanted to leave, they could have just watched the videos online. But even if I wasn't videotaping my lectures, should I have canceled my class anyway? Who says yes? No. Interesting. Who says no? Yes, why not?
It defeats the purpose of a walkout. If you're canceling class anyways, then it's like, well, it's like telling everybody to do something, whereas if it's a walkout, it's showing that people care more about something than they do for like class, for example.
Yeah, great points. If I didn't cancel the class, or if I did cancel the class, might as well have had the walkout on a Saturday morning. Right? So let's talk a bit about strategy, about organizing. How should you design a mechanism that has that leads to the least amount of confusion? So say it's an auction, or it's a protest, or something else. This has been a very contentious topic. And only 2 years ago did somebody come up, I guess 3 years ago now, did somebody come up with an idea. And it's called, obviously, strategy-proof mechanism. Strategy-proof means that basically in economics, when people, or game theory really, strategy means cheating. Strategizing means cheating, or being dishonest. And obviously strategy-proof mechanism is a situation where it's obvious where you shouldn't lie, where you shouldn't be dishonest, or you shouldn't cheat. you can express it, very simple equation. The worst outcome of your best strategy has to be at least as good as the best outcome of your worst strategy. The obvious case with this is a typical, what we call an English auction. That's sort of the auctions that you're most familiar with, where you go in and then somebody's offering a pen for sale and say how much. You say $1, and then you go $2, $3, $5. It just goes up until a price nobody else wants to bid more than. And then whoever bids the highest pays that. That's the most common type of auction that we see. There are other auctions too. There's something called a Dutch auction, which is how they auction off tulips in the Netherlands. There's like a secret auction, right? You write down your bid in a sealed envelope, you hide it, you don't know what anyone else bid, and then whoever has the highest bid wins. And sometimes they'll even add another rule that say whoever has the highest bid wins, but pays the second highest price. Mathematically, all these different auctions are supposed to give you the same results. But in real life, we don't see that. We see the English auction dominate. Why? It's because in the English auction, it's obvious to you individually what you value this object that you're bidding on. And it's obvious if you bid above your value on this, on the object, and then you win, you're worse off. If you value this pen at $1, and then you bid $10 for it, obviously you wouldn't do that, obviously. But if this was a second price auction, where you would bid $10, and then if the next highest bidder was only 50 cents, you would win this, but only pay 50 cents. So that creates opportunities for strategizing, aka being dishonest about what you truly value for this pen. Legal systems also adopt this sort of strategy implicitly. If somebody breaks a law, how do you punish that person? Should you punish that person? Well, if you don't want someone to doing a certain action, let's say it's murder. How do you deal with murder? Well, you got to make, if your intention is to have fewer murders, you got to make it so that the worst thing that can happen for you to not to commit a murder is still better than the best outcome that happens when you do commit a murder. Does that make sense? If the best outcome for committing a murder is that you also get killed, and then maybe your family has to pay some ransom as well, blood money, then maybe that's a bigger incentive against murdering than a slap on the wrist. In California, yeah, question.
Say, so
You gotta speak up.
Say you don't commit the murder, but you're accused of it and you go to jail, versus the person who actually committed the murder who goes free, isn't that switched?
Well, if you have been accused of murder, it's in your interest to prove that you haven't been accused. And if the murderer goes away free, that's a problem. So that's a problem with administering justice. But we're just trying to think about designing a justice system. Okay? On this question of design, California, they passed a proposition a couple of years ago called Proposition 47. California, they have this weird system where you can write a law, and then instead of the government voting on it, it's led up to basically a referendum with the state. And a couple of years ago, there was something called Proposition 47, which, among other things, made it so that theft under $950 went from being a felony to a misdemeanor. Not only that, but also the San Francisco Attorney General came out and said that we're not even going to arrest anyone, we're not going to prosecute anyone who's been accused of a misdemeanor theft. What do you think the outcome has been of the Attorney General of San Francisco saying that they're not going to prosecute anyone stealing or accused of stealing less than $950? Yes?
People are stealing items less than $950. More people are stealing less than $950.
There's been a massive increase in people stealing in petty theft, right? Yeah.
I have a question about that. Does that mean, like, can they get multiple misdemeanors and then it becomes, or is it like
No.
each case?
Each case is case by case.
Okay.
So you can, in one day, you can hit up 10 different stores for $949, get away with $9,490, and you wouldn't be charged with a crime. Yes?
When they say we won't, actually say like.
Prosecutes. Yeah.
Does it go on the record?
Prosecute means that the state will not sue someone accused of such a crime.
So does it go on the record or?
No. Well, let's actually break it down. Two things can go on your record. A guilty conviction, but also if you've been arrested. How do you think police have been responding to this set of circumstances? Yeah.
Would it be arresting people less because they know it like won't end in them being like fully charged with anything?
Yeah, they haven't been arresting people at all. They haven't been arresting people at all in petty theft cases. Does that sound like a Wild West to you or a tamer West? Question?
Well, it sounds like the Wild West, but not the Wild West.
Doesn't sound, it sounds like what you were led to believe about the Wild West. But after reading for this class, you'll see it was a myth drummed up by suspicious powers. And now, in supposedly the civilized West, we have rampant theft, rampant property crime. Yes?
So then my question is, why would anybody support this law in the first place if it's leading to an increase in petty theft?
That's a good question. The original arguments were that these are non-violent crimes and they're diverting police resources from more serious crimes. So they had the governing party, the Democrats in California were big pushers of this proposal, as was an organization called the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union is an interesting organization. They try to defend the constitutional right of anyone, even if it's people they disagree with. For example, they were famously defending the Ku Klux Klan for marching in the streets. They said that's an expression of free speech, it's protected by the Constitution, they should have the right to do this. That was a notorious part of their organization and their history. They also support this sort of bill as well. I had a question over here. Yeah.
If someone stole something from you under $950, could you make like a civil case against them to try and get back money or whatever?
You could. It's costly, yeah, but you wouldn't have the police helping. You wouldn't have the police helping. Yeah.
How does the shop owner like defend himself?
So that's the question right now. So it's been increasing a lot. And the worry is a lot of stores are just going to close and move out of state because they can't defend themselves. Yeah.
What happens if someone that got robbed like retaliates and injures the person who is stealing the stuff Could they get charged for injuring the person?
Yeah, so if there are a lot of laws that really govern how you're allowed to defend yourselves. If you're defending yourself from a personal attack, then you're allowed to use violence. But if somebody's stealing from you, the amount of physical force you're allowed to use is heavily restricted. There was a case in Toronto about 7-8 years ago, maybe a bit longer, but in Chinatown in Toronto, somebody was stealing from a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper chased him down, tackled him, tied him up, and called 911. And then the police charged him with what was something like false detainments or something similar to that. And it made big national press that a shopkeeper was defending his own property, but it was against the law, so it was a big issue. And the police eventually dropped the charge, but that law still exists on the books. Yeah.
Aren't there laws that somebody like breaking into your house, like in the States at least, like, they have way like less strict carrying rules, but
In some states,
yeah, like
there's something called the Castle Doctrine. Who's heard of the Castle Doctrine? What's the Castle Doctrine?
Not only do you have the right to defend your person with force, but also proceed to on your property.
It comes from an old English legal doctrine that said every man's house is his castle, and you have the right to defend your castle up to the point of death. If somebody was invading your house, you could kill them. Some U.S. states still preserve this doctrine, but some don't. New York State doesn't. Yes?
Is that the same as like the standard law?
No. Yes?
You know, this is increase the amount of guns and stuff that's
I don't have that information. No. Yes?
Is it any different, like, I don't know if it's part of it.
Sorry. Quiet, please, guys.
I don't know if it's part of it, but I thought there was like a law or something that if the person has their back to you, you're not like, specifically like with that regulations or whatever, but if you have their back to you, you can get in trouble for shooting them or something like that. Would that be part of that?
Yeah, so that varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Texas would be very lenient on that sort of limitation. Yes?
With your law of like the under a certain amount of money, does that include like armed robbery or just like?
No, it's just theft. So armed robbery is something different. Armed robbery is always a felony. Any other questions? Thought I saw a few more. So the reading you'll read today will talk a lot about anarchy. Anarchy. It'll talk a lot about the different property rights regimes of the cattlemen, as well as the natives in the United States and spreading across the United States. You'll learn that I'll also include links to what's happening with Somalia and also what's happened with, or how pirate societies organize themselves. This was just another reminder on that there's a distinction between law and legislation. Always keep that distinction in mind. Are there any other questions? If that's it, then let's call it